Now that you've learned the basics of working with MySQL, now we need to learn how we can actually connect that with the PHP training that we've already done. So let's dig in and figure out how. Within Sublime Text 2, I've created a new folder called MySQL Connect, and now we need to add a file. Well, the first thing we know that we need to do is connect to a database. So I'm going to begin by creating a new functions.php file. Now, ultimately, we will have functions, but for now, I just want to show you the actual step-by-step code. Now, the most important thing I need to say about this lesson specifically is, a bit strangely maybe, these are anti-patterns. The only reason I'm going to show you this deprecated way of connecting to and working with databases is because it's still very rampant in the community, but nonetheless, it is considered an anti-pattern. If you're not familiar with that term, anti-pattern, that means essentially bad practice, don't use it. It's considered a bad practice to use it. It's an anti-pattern. So what I will do at the very top here is write anti-patterns, only for reference. This way, when you're learning outside of Tuts Plus Premium and you come across tutorials and they reference things like this, you'll know, okay, I learned about that and I know that that's a bad practice and I probably shouldn't follow this tutorial. Or also keep in mind that some of these tutorials might be rather old and they were using that function when it still was okay. But now these days there are much better choices that we will take a look at in the next lesson. Okay, so now that we know that we're dealing with bad practices in this lesson, a bit ironically, let's dig in and see how we would have done it the old way. So the first thing we would have to do is connect to our database. If I switch over to the terminal and I connect to our database, and I show databases, we can see, okay, let's work with that practice database again. So use practice and show tables. That's right, we have the orders and the users table that we discussed in a previous lesson. So let's figure out how we can connect. The first thing I will do is switch to distraction-free mode, and we're going to use the MySQL Connect function. Now this is going to accept just a handful of parameters. The first is going to be the host. Well, we know that that's localhost in our case. The second parameter is going to be the username to connect to it. We have it set to root for now. And the third parameter is the password, which we set to Tuts Plus. So for now, let's just try to connect to it. And if we couldn't, we will die. Could not connect. So let's go ahead and run this. Now, if you're working along and you get this same error, it's probably because of a couple reasons. One, maybe you have two different versions of PHP installed, and that would be the case for me because I have my working version 5.4, but then I have the version that I'm using in this course, which is part of MAMP, which would be around 5.3.7, give or take. So if you get this issue where you know the password is correct, but you're still getting access denied, it's probably because it's not connecting to the socket properly. So I'll show you a few ways that we can figure this out. I'm going to switch over to the terminal right here, and we know that we can run php-v to determine the version. So in this case, my default PHP is 5.4, but I also have an additional version that was installed as part of MAMP, and that would be an applications MAMP within the bin, within PHP, 5.3, within the bin directory, and PHP. There we go. And if I run v, now we can see, okay, that is the 5.3 version. Now, if you're in this situation where you have one or more versions installed, one thing that you can do is to comment this out and echo PHP info, like that. Now, if I run it in the browser, we're going to see, okay, it is working with 5.3, and we're going to look for mysql.sock, and this is the socket connection. And now you can see it's trying to look for it there. But the problem is that this is not the right path for my specific machine. For your machine, it may be correct. So to figure out what I need, I'm going to go back to the terminal, and this time I'll show you a little trick. We can run php-i, which is the command line version of PHP info that we just ran. So if I run that, we're going to get all this information about our PHP installation. But what I really want to do is just do a quick search within that. So we can use, within the command line, the pipe. So I can say, get that output and pipe it through the grep command, which is sort of like a glorified search method. So I'm going to look for mysql.sock. And now we'll only see the results that contain mysql.sock in some place. And now what I see is this is the actual path that I want, /temp/mysql.sock. Now, there's a couple ways we can fix this. I can dig into the php.ini file and update the path. Or what I can do is when I'm connecting to my database, and I'll remove this and uncomment the line below, we can also be explicit and set the path, like so. So now I'm saying localhost, and here is the path to mysql.sock. So now if we try it and I reload the page, we're not going to get anything, and that means we connected to it successfully. But very likely in your case, just running localhost like this, you'll have a successful connection. Now, if you don't, and this method doesn't work for you either, just create a thread within the Tuts Premium forums and we'll help you out. As I noted, this is a bit of a unique situation for my system. So now at this point, we've created a connection, and I want to store a reference to that connection within this variable con for connection. Next, I want to select the DB that I'm working with. So we'll use another function, MySQL select DB, and we know that we're working with the practice database that we created in a previous lesson. And finally, we want to run a query. So if I go back to the terminal, let's once again select MySQL. There we go. Use practice, show tables, and we'll select star from the users. These are the records that I'd like to retrieve. So select star from user, that's going to be the command that we want. So I will run MySQL query select star from users. And it will know that because we ran this function, and by the way, we can also pass a reference to our connection. It'll do that for you, but sometimes it's a good practice to be explicit about that. So it now knows select star from users, and we are working with the practice database. So I'm going to store that within a variable called results, and then we will run a while statement. While row equals MySQL fetch object. We can also fetch a row or array, but I like to work with them as objects. So fetch object, and I'm going to pass in our result set. For now, let's just print our row and see what we get. I'm going to come back, reload the page, and view the source. And now you see there were 2 records within the table, and that's what we get in response. So now if you wanted, you could echo row username, and I'm also going to append a break tag after it. One more time. There we go. And now we have selected all of the users from the database. But now I want you to think about reusability. What if you need to select from a different table? Well, a lot of this would have to be repeated. So even though we're working with anti-patterns here, why don't we clean it up a little bit into functions? The first one I'm going to do is create a function called connect. And this function will be responsible for connecting to MySQL. So I know that it should accept a host, and I'm going to set a default to localhost, and that should be fine for you. But for me, I'm going to also set the path to mysql.sock in my particular case. Next, we want to have the username and the password. Now we can just repeat everything we did here. Paste that in, and I'll get rid of this first one, change that to host, change the next one to username, and the final one will be changed to password. I'm also going to get rid of the or die in this particular case. So now we've created a new connection. I'm just going to return that like that. So now we can just call that function connect localhost temp mysql.sock. The username is root. The password is tuts plus. This would probably be stored within a configuration file. You'll rarely find that you actually hard code that in. You'll want to store that information in one location and one location only. But for now, it's okay. So now we've created a new connection. We'll store that reference, and let's see if this is still working as we would hope. Reload the page. Yep, that's working great. Let's improve this now. MySQL select DB, I think it would be nice if when I connect to the database, I give myself the option of specifying the database that I want. Well, that's pretty easy. Let's copy this and bring it into our function. Now I'm no longer going to return. I'm going to store that within a connection variable and ultimately return that connection string. Next, the function should accept a DB, but I want it to be optional. So I will set that to an empty string. Then I can say if not empty DB, if it's not an empty string, then the user wants to select a DB, in which case we run this function. Finally, we return the connection. So now let's come back, reload the page. We're getting the exact same thing, but now we have this function called connect that will do a lot of the initial setup for us. That way, from our other file, we simply need to call the connect function. Next, we have MySQL query. And then we also have this situation where we have to run through row equals MySQL fetch object so that we can filter through the results set. So why don't we create a new function called query? And this is going to accept our query, of course. And let's just grab this and paste it in. Now I can replace this with the query that is passed. This should be fairly familiar to you now. If you're still confused, go back and watch some of the lessons on functions in this course. Now I'm going to run query, select star from users. And what I want this function to do is run our query and also take care of this information for us. Because ideally, what I want in response is just an object that I can filter through. So let's say results. And now we can come back and fix this. We will say if there were results, meaning something was returned, in that case, let's grab all this, paste it in like so, and then we will store everything within an array. So we'll say rows equals array, and then we will populate this. So for each one, we're going to add a new item to the rows array, and we will just take that current row and append it to the array. Then finally, I can return rows. There we go. So now let's print our results, come back, run it, and if I view the source, now we have this array of information. And then at that point, it becomes a lot easier to work with because I can say if there were results, and notice that's how I want to interact with it. I want to say if there were results, then I want to filter through them. Otherwise, maybe you want to display some kind of notice. So that means right here, it's possible that rows does not exist because rows is only created if there were results. So I'm going to take this and place it within my if statement like so, and then return false at the bottom. That way, if there were no results, we return false. If there were results, we're going to fill up this rows array with the rows that were returned from the query, and then we return that from the function. That way, the code within here will only run if there were results. Okay, then I could say for each results as row, and for now, I will just echo row username, and let's add on a break tag. One more time, and now we're getting the same thing, but now we've created these two functions to abstract away a lot of the logic. And the same thing would be true for your connect function. You might want to do something right here that says if there was not a connection, then maybe you either want to return false, or maybe you want to immediately die because your application depends on it, in which you could say die could not connect. And I'm sorry, I mean, if there was not a connection made, then you can die. So that would be one way to do it. There's lots of different ways. I'm going to leave that commented out for now, and maybe you can work on that on your own time. All right, so now we have our functions. Let's create a new file. So I will exit out of distraction-free mode, and let's create a new file called index.php. Within here, we'll add some HTML and a doc type, and I want to make sure I include that functions file. Or better yet, maybe we should require it. There we go. So now we have our functions, those can be used, and now we can say at the top, paste this code in here. We have our connection, we try to connect to it, we run our query, and then I can take all of this out and paste it within the body of our page. And I'll make sure I wrap that within PHP. So let's try this out, come back, reload the page, and I'm going to go to index.php this time, and now we're getting the same thing. So let's go back and do our final cleanup. Here, we're still probably adding too much. If we're trying to think of this as a view, let's create a new file called index.template or index.view.php. Just figure out a system and stick with it. I'll use view for this particular lesson, and then we'll take our entire view and paste it within here. Now I can come back to index.php. We require our functions file. We create a couple variables that we need. And then I can require index.view.php. The view will inherit any of these variables that we've created. So we should get the same thing. Reload, yep, getting the same effect. But what if no rows were returned? For example, maybe we want to select star from a table that doesn't exist. Well, in that case, we get nothing at all, and that's not very helpful. So why don't we do an else statement right here, and we can echo no rows returned. One more time, and now we at least have some result. And of course, this would be a big website, and you can format that however you want. You might want to put these in a list item or whatever you want to do with it. But now take a look at how our view is actually very clean. This is okay. We're not doing any real logic. We're just filtering through some rows or otherwise displaying some information. So let's see if there's anything else we need to do. I'll come back to index.php and hide the sidebar. And now I'm seeing that this connection variable, I want to be able to use it within our query function, like that. So let's go back to functions and make sure that it accepts that connection. And then we can paste it in right here. One more time, reload the page. Yep, we get those 2 rows. If we come back to our database and we insert into users, the username, values equals my name. There we go. Now if I come back, reload the page, now we have a new item that was returned from the database. And now, of course, everything that you learned in the previous lessons about MySQL can be implemented here. So if we go to index.php, we can say select star from users, order by username in ascending order. Now reload the page, and we're ordering it by the username in ascending order. Or if we want to start at the end, descending, there we go. Or maybe we want to limit it to only 2 results. Now we're only getting 2. So yeah, everything that we've learned in the previous lessons can be implemented here. For now, I'll just keep it like that. So let's recap. We have our functions file. This code is implemented fine, but the technique is an anti-pattern. And I want to clarify this. Using the old MySQL Connect API is an anti-pattern. We have our connect function. We do some error checking. If there wasn't a connection, you should compensate for that in some manner. We've also given the option to specify a database. And we created a second function so that we can query the database and return a set of rows in a bit more of a cleaner fashion. Next, we have our controller. That includes the functions. We perform our connection. We query the database, and we return the rows within this results variable, which is an array. And then within our view, we filter through the returned results, and we echo out the fields that we need to. Now, as the final thing, remember how I noted that you probably won't be doing this. Instead, maybe you will have a config.php file. And then within here, you could say maybe, among other things, you could have a config array. And maybe within here, you could say db username is root and db password is tuts plus. And why don't we also do db host? And then, as you can imagine, this makes it a lot easier when you need to update that information. You can also specify options. For example, when you're working locally, use these connections to connect to the local database. But when you're on your server, you need to use different credentials. So in this case, I'll set localhost, which is good for you, but for me, I'm going to add on the path to the mysql.sock. So now we have this config array. Let's include that as well. Config.php. And now we can replace all of this information right up here with config db username and config db password. And excuse me, I need to add on the closing bracket there. And then finally, we have the database, and we'll hard code that in. And lastly, we'll just get rid of this one as well. Config db host. One more time, reload the page. We're getting the exact same thing, but now, once again, this is a little bit cleaner. And if you want, you can even make it easier on the eyes by putting each of these on their own line. Remember, PHP is not white space dependent, so that's okay. Reload the page, still working just fine. But now we've started to dig into this idea of having a config file, and this would be the beginnings of it. This would be anything related to the configuration of your web application. All right, and that's going to do it for this lesson. As a final word of caution, remember, using the old MySQL Connect API is an anti-pattern. It's a bad practice for a number of reasons. One, it's just not nearly as flexible. If not used properly, it very much lends itself to what is referred to as SQL injection, and that's something I'll teach you about in future lessons. But for now, at your level of training, just accept it's not a good idea to use it. Instead, you want to be using PDO, which is what we're going to learn in the next lesson.